So I'm going to start with a story, and this is a story that I bet a lot of people in the room already know. We'll see. And it begins once upon a time. So once upon a time, a large, very poor but resource-rich country, just emerging from a period of violent conflict, decided to focus on development. We need to modernize our infrastructure, they said. We need to build railways, we need to import new technologies, and we need to figure out how to get more coal out of our mines. And soon they had a visit from a large, wealthy Asian country that had already become a major importer of their oil. And this Asian country offered them a bargain. We will give you a line of credit worth $10 billion, and you can import our technologies. Our companies can build your infrastructure and develop your mines. You can repay us with your oil. And many in the poor country were intensely suspicious of this wealthy Asian power, but they agreed to the bargain and the work began. So, which two countries am I talking about? Well, clearly one of the countries was China. China was a large, poor country with oil. And the other country was Japan. As I hope quite a few people in this room know, but in many of my audiences that's not the case. China was just emerging from the Cultural Revolution. At the time was 30 years ago, or longer. And when Deng Xiaoping first proposed this in China, it was intensely controversial. But he prevailed, and China went on to prosper, and this relationship helped, particularly at the beginning. And there are several points here that relate to China's engagement in Africa. And the first is that this was not altruism on Japan's part. It wasn't foreign aid. This first $10 billion line of credit was at commercial rates. Foreign aid did come later, but that was not there at the beginning. But most importantly, and second, is that China saw this relationship, this bargain, our natural resources for your technology and your experience, as something that would be good for their development. Japan was pleased to get access to China's oil and coal and sell them advanced technology and engineering services. And the rest, as they say, is history. So I hope at least some of you in the room were surprised by this. Anybody? No?
Yes.
It's one of many surprises that people will find in this book, because China's offering the same bargain to many African countries today. Leverage what you have and what we want. Oil in Congo-Brazzaville, sesame in Ethiopia, cocoa in Ghana, to build the telecoms, the power, the railway stations, the mines that you believe to be necessary for your country's modernization. And on hearing of one major deal in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, an editor at the Financial Times wrote, Beijing has thrown down its most direct challenge yet to the West's architecture for aiding African development. And I think he was right. The challenge is not just about the things we're reading in the newspaper, about debt sustainability, about poor environmental standards, low labor standards, governance issues, and social standards, important and real as these issues may be. It is more fundamentally about how the aid and development finance architecture actually work and how it might change. This book is about Chinese aid and state-sponsored economic engagement in Africa. And that's the starting point. And at the beginning, I had a more academic title. It was something like Chinese Strategic Engagement in Africa, something or something. But while I learned a lot of things about publishing. This isn't my first book at all, but it's the first one I've written that seems to be generating a lot of interest. And so my publisher was very aware of that. And when I was off doing field work in rural Sierra Leone or Zambia or Tanzania somewhere, and not even on email, my editor put the proposal forward to her board, and she changed the title unilaterally, and she called it Rogue Donor with a question mark, the real story of China and Africa. And so I found this out in an internet cafe somewhere, and I said, oh my God. But at this point it had already gone out in a trade catalog, and it was like circulating around the internet, and so I finally got the title changed, but we had to compromise on the subtitle. But my editor, when the book was released in the UK in November last year, she was very annoyed with me because a week earlier, Sarah Palin had released her memoir, Going Rogue, and my editor said, see, you know, we could have had some tie-in promotions, your own donor, Going Rogue, and so on. Alas. But seriously, I wrote this book out of both alarm and scholarly curiosity. The alarm was because both the West and China itself present distorted images of this relationship. In the Chinese media, the move into Africa is presented along wholly positive lines. We are good friends who help each other. China is a sincere partner. The Tanzam Railway is regularly trotted out as a symbol of China's selfless intentions toward the continent. But in reality, Chinese companies are down in the dirt doing deals with dictators, and many are apparently giving kickbacks with gusto, and they're doing all the same things that Western companies have been doing for quite a long time. And on the other hand, the Western media is almost wholly negative. We read that the Chinese are the new colonialists, that their aid is toxic, that they're making poverty worse, that China gives billions in aid to prop up pariah regimes like Sudan or Zimbabwe, that China's leading the charge to grab huge swaths of land across Africa, or that they bring in all their own labor and don't hire Africans. And much of this, in fact, is not true. So when I did this research, I drew on, as Jen said, a long history of this. My first book was on Chinese aid, and African development, and that I started doing research on really in 1983. So in some ways you could say this book is almost 30 years in the works, although the most recent research was over the past 3 years. And when I was writing this book, I often felt like Akira Kurosawa, the Japanese film director. And why did I feel like that? It's because of his film Rashomon. You know that film? There's an event that happens in the woods, and you see it once and you think you know what it's all about. And then you see it again, and you realize that the first vision that you had may not have actually depicted the reality. And so that's what I do in this book. I present the conventional wisdom, and then I show you another perspective, and maybe even yet another perspective on it. And through that, I think we get down to a deeper understanding of what China's actually doing. So I do deconstruct this conventional wisdom. I only have time for a few of the myths and realities that I talk about in the book, and there are many, maybe 20 that I go over. So let me just address 4. And the first is about how much aid China gives. Now, we hear that Chinese aid is huge, and this is probably the biggest, most repeated error on this topic. For example, on a study that the World Bank did in 2008, I believe, on infrastructure. It's called Building Bridges. It was Chinese infrastructure projects in Africa. It's a pretty good study. But at one point they say there that China's given Africa $44 billion in aid over the years until the end of 2006. And when I saw this, I thought, this is way off. This is much higher than it should be. And so I looked at their sources, and they had gotten that figure out of a Dow Jones article that was reporting on a visit that Chinese Premier Wen Jiabao had done in North Africa. And so I went to the Chinese sources on this, and I didn't even have to go to the Zhongguan, the Chinese. I went to the English translations of Xinhua for that. And I found out that what Wen Jiabao had said was 44 billion renminbi, and that's about $5.6 billion. And so this is something the World Bank didn't check, and they didn't think, and they just accepted as, you know, something that would then come out in their publications. And there are many other examples of this. In fact, I have one chapter just giving my estimates of Chinese aid, which is a lot lower. It's about, by my estimates, about $1.9 billion a year on average over the past 3 years. And this is a lot lower than most people think. But if you want to know my rationale and my sources for that, you have to read that chapter. The Chinese do not make this kind of research easy. Foreign aid is not published. Even the investment figures are not broken down by sectors going to Africa. The export credits for Africa, we don't know how much they are out of the total export credits. So there's a lot that is just not reported. We don't know the breakdown between concessional and non-concessional loans. But there's a lot more information if you are able to dig, and if you're able to do interviews. You can actually put together a much more complete picture than we have, and that's what I've done in this project. So aid is not big. On the other hand, Chinese economic engagement in general is huge. Chinese trade has gone from $10 billion a year in 2000 to $106 billion a year in 2008. This is an enormous increase. And if you look at the graphs of this, it goes up like that, almost like climbing a ladder. They're second now only to the United States for the African continent. And Chinese investment is probably also up by the same factor of 10, although the figures that we have are not accurate. They don't reflect a lot of the investments that have actually happened. But yet it's quite large. Aid is small, but there are a lot of other things that the Chinese are doing as well. Now, let me go into the second large myth, which is that Chinese aid and engagement in Africa are all about oil or natural resources. Now, countering this myth is going to be one of the more controversial of my arguments. But I say this first because evidence on aid, and on particularly the grants and zero interest loans that come out of the Ministry of Commerce, is that it is primarily political. Aid is widely spread across the continent. In fact, it's far more evenly spread than aid from the Western donors, who tend to have their donor favorites. The Francophone countries get aid from France, the Anglophone countries get aid from England. And then other countries are left as donor orphans. So every country in Africa, including Mauritius, South Africa, Botswana, countries far wealthier on a per capita basis than China, has received aid from China, except Swaziland. The only requirement really is that you have to have diplomatic relations with Beijing and not with Taipei in order to get aid of some degree or magnitude. Now, what about the large loans that we see in the media? And we see this quite a bit. We see $4.5 billion in Chinese aid, in Chinese loans for Angola and rising. Figures of $9 billion for the Democratic Republic of the Congo, though that's been cut back recently, and other very large figures in the media. Well, these loans, the $4.5 billion for Angola, for example, from the China Exim Bank, were even described in a recent report by Chatham House in London, which was, again, a very good report, but they described these loans as deeply concessional, which surely makes them sound like aid. But in fact, the researchers at Chatham House were wrong to say that they were concessional. These loans were given on a LIBOR basis. And since I'm in New York here, and we're here at Jones Day, you probably all know what LIBOR is, but just in case there are some people who don't, let me explain. LIBOR is the London Interbank Offered Rate, and this is a rate that banks give each other. And it's the loans that were given to Angola and the other Chinese loans from the Exim Bank, for the most part, are given at LIBOR plus. And so they're at LIBOR plus 1.5% or LIBOR plus 1% or something along those lines. And this is very similar to loans that are given to Angola by Western banks. For example, Standard Chartered gives its loans to Angola at LIBOR plus 2.5%. So that one percentage point of difference doesn't make this into foreign aid. And indeed, these loans are not described by the Chinese as aid. They're just described by others that way. So oil and minerals are a huge part of Chinese interest in Africa. And I don't mean to say that they aren't. I mean, they clearly are a huge part. But there are a lot of other things going on there. For example, year to year, infrastructure contracts that are signed by Chinese companies in Africa are actually far larger than any of the estimates that we have on investment. In 2008, for example, Chinese companies in Africa signed new infrastructure contracts worth $40 billion. And they reported revenues of $20 billion just for that year. And Chinese finance will pay for only a fraction of these. The others are paid by African governments that have money. For example, hundreds of contracts in Nigeria. Private companies in Africa that hire Chinese companies to do construction for them. The World Bank and the African Development Bank. Right now, Chinese companies are winning more than half of all of the infrastructure contracts tendered by the African Development Bank, and they're almost getting to that point for the World Bank. And by donors who have helpfully untied their aid, which has been a growing trend amongst donors from the West and even from Japan. And their tenders are now being won by Chinese companies as well. Now, the Chinese have not untied their aid. It's still tied, by and large, to goods and services from China. And then another example is that China's single largest investment in Africa to date, the single largest one investment, has been, does anyone know? Exactly, 20% of Standard Bank in South Africa. That was $5 billion, more or less, and that's the single largest investment. that's been completed, signed, sealed, delivered. And it's even reflected in the data that we see. So I think for all of these reasons, and there are more in the book, my argument that is about a lot more than oil, I think is justified. As a Nigerian official said to me when I interviewed him actually in Beijing, he said, the West comes here and it's oil, oil, oil. But the Chinese come here and they're interested in everything. And so what are they interested in outside of oil? Let's look at that, because it sheds light on the impact, or the likely impact, or the potential impact of Chinese engagement in Africa. And so I want to speak in particular about manufacturing and governance, all right? So manufacturing. The conventional wisdom on Chinese impact on manufacturing in Africa is dismal. We have the idea that Chinese exports to the continent, and they are huge. For example, the trade figures that I mentioned of about $106 billion, roughly half of that is oil and resources and other goods coming out from Africa and going to China. But the other half of that is goods from China coming to Africa. And this is very different, for example, from the United States, where we have, I think the trade figures were around $120 billion in 2008 for the continent. And that was almost $100 billion coming from Africa to the United States, again, mainly resources, and then only 20-some billion going from the United States to Africa in terms of our exports going there. And so the market for China is much, much bigger than it is for us going there. And so that shows you that Chinese exporters are very interested in this market. And Africa is it's not only the low end, it's the medium and the high end. All of these goods are going to Africa, a lot at the low end, to be sure. But some of China's flagship companies like ZTE and Huawei and Haier have got huge projects in Africa. And they're setting up the telecommunications networks that are bringing Africa into the 21st century across the continent. Now, manufacturing. All of this trade that's been going into Africa has been very tough on African manufacturers who have had their markets opened up quite helpfully by the World Bank and the IMF in the 1990s through structural adjustment programs. And so we have seen this particularly in the textile industry. The textile industry across most of Africa is an import substitution industrialization set of industries. And so it was substituting for imports, and it is antiquated, it has not been modernized, and it is being wiped out by Chinese imports. Many of these are smuggled into countries like Nigeria that try to ban it. So they have a ban on textile imports, but it comes in through the countries around. So for example, you look at Chinese textile exports to Benin, which is next door to Nigeria, and they're huge. And they're going to cross the border into Nigeria and helping to wipe out those companies. But there's another story here. And that story is that when you actually look at the data on what manufacturing rates of growth have been doing in a number of African countries that have intensive engagement from China, they've been going up for the past 5 years. And so you see on average for a sample of 15 countries in Africa, it went from an average around 4% to an average around 6% over the past 5 years. So it's not looking as though manufacturing has been wiped out. And some of this is coming from Chinese investment in manufacturing. And this is something we hear very little about. The single largest, the fastest growing sector of Chinese exports to Africa is equipment and machinery. Now most of this is going into construction. So it's the equipment that's the Caterpillars and the other things. Some of them actually have American labels on them, like John Deere tractors are coming from China and going into Africa. But some of it is equipment going into factories, because Chinese are getting pushed by their government and they're getting attracted into African markets. And they are doing this in part assisted by a number of innovative programs that the Chinese government has put in place. These are programs like the $5 billion China-Africa Development Fund, as an equity fund put together by the China Development Bank. And this is added about $1 billion right now, with about $2 billion worth of investments, and they have a minority share in all of them. So a lot of those investments, or some of them in any case, are going into manufacturing. We also have these 7 overseas special economic zones. 6 are underway and 1 is still in abeyance in Algeria. But these are being developed along the lines of some of the overseas or the special economic zones in China. Shenzhen, for example. This is a model that's being exported now by the government. But they're being done on an interesting model. And this model shows, I think, what the Chinese have learned from their own examination of failures in their own past aid projects. And they have been in Africa for 50 years. A lot of their aid did not work well. It was not sustainable. And so they did a lot of studies of this. And they tried to figure out how could they engage in ways that would be more sustainable. And this, again, is not about altruism. It's about mutual benefit. It's about, which is a core foundational principle in Chinese foreign policy. And so these overseas special economic zones are something that African governments want because they want to foster manufacturing, they want to foster employment, and the ones that I've seen are employing predominantly African workers. But this will also help in China's efforts to move the lower end of manufacturing offshore and move Chinese companies up the value chain at home. And so these are labor intensive and resource intensive leather industries, sometimes textile industries, and mineral processing industries. And these are being promoted to move to other parts of the world. The process is quite interesting how this is being done. There are, right now, the idea is to have 50 of these worldwide eventually. But right now, 19 have been selected. And this was all done through competitive tenders in Beijing in 2 rounds, in 2006 and 2007. And these competitive tenders were answered by Chinese companies who put together proposals to build these zones in countries that they were familiar with. And so the proposals went through several rounds, and finally they ended up in front of a panel in Beijing. And this panel was university professors and people from China's own special economic zones like Tianjin and Shenzhen. They came and they were judges on the proposals. And they selected. The first round selected 9, and the second round selected 11, and Africa ended up with 7 of these. And so it is something that the Chinese hope will be more sustainable than their ordinary foreign aid. It brings government support to bear, subsidies and grants from the government, helping to build the infrastructure for these zones, but then things like a $1 billion fund for African small and medium enterprises was just set up in November last year, and that will be to help these enterprises in part to invest in these zones. So there are a lot of different ways this is all being mixed together. The China Africa Development Fund is taking equity shares in 3 of these zones. So these tools are supposed to be synergistic, and we'll see. And then there are private entrepreneurs like Innocent Chakuma, who are also interacting with Chinese entrepreneurs and doing joint ventures in manufacturing. I visited Innocent Chakuma in May last year in Nigeria, and his factories are near the Niger Delta, where there have been a lot of kidnappings and armed robberies. And so when he took me from his factories, or he sent me from his factories in Enugu to his factories in Newi, where I had been for going on and off since 1991 when I first went there for the World Bank, he gave me an escort of 2 policemen with AK-47s. And so we went down the road, and there were 12 roadblocks along the way in which they were checking for various nefarious characters who might be moving in and out of that area. And one AK-47 went out that window, and the other went out that window, and they wouldn't even chat with me because they were just scanning the road to make sure that nothing was going to be happening. So this was an interesting research experience that I had. And so he's doing joint ventures with Chinese companies with whom he's been trading. And they've been partners in trading for 10 years. And now they're moving into production together. And it takes a long time to build up this trust on both sides. So they will form joint ventures. And there were other entrepreneurs that I spoke to as well who had the same kind of experience. Again, many, many years of trading, becoming trusting of each other through doing business for a long time together. And so this is happening in several other places as well. One of the things he's producing is plastics. And I had read in, there's this great journalistic story in, I think it's in Fast Company by, I can't remember his name, but he went around Africa and did all of these really... Richard Behar. Exactly, Richard Behar. He did these kind of sensational stories about the Chinese here and there and everywhere. And in one of these stories, he says China is wiping out the plastics industry in Nigeria. And so when I was visiting this factory that Innocent Chakuma is running, and he has 1,000 Nigerian workers, and he has building after building producing plastics, and he's one of the big major plastics manufacturers in Nigeria. And I said to him, well, I have read that China's wiping out the plastics industry in Nigeria. So how are you able to compete? And so he said to me, well, he said, it's not that hard. He said, I actually have a tire factory. It's a joint venture in China. So I know how things work there, and I pay my workers the same. I pay the same salary there and here. He said, I bring the machinery from China. So we're all using the same machinery. He said, the raw materials come from Port Harcourt, which is here in Nigeria. And he said, I have a distribution network all over Nigeria and the neighboring states. And he said, it's not that hard. And I'm doing very well, he said. So why wouldn't I be able to outcompete the Chinese? This is my home territory. So that kind of example is, I think, got the potential to multiply in a lot of other parts of Africa. And we can see it happening, and there are other examples in my book. But because my time is short here, let me move on to the next topic, which is governance. Now, governance is an area that I've been working in also for a long time. I did a short book on aid dependence and governance several years ago. And so I was very interested to know how was China's engagement going to affect governance in Africa. And many argue that with China rising, progress in human rights and democracy and good governance across the continent will be reversed. But I predict that the impact of Chinese engagement is likely to be more marginal than most people believe. And why do I say this? Well, first, I say this because there's no evidence that China is more comfortable with authoritarian regimes or seeks them out in particular. Their largest trading partner has traditionally been South Africa. And this was superseded last year or the year before by Angola because the price of oil went up so high and Chinese oil from Angola increased. But up until then, it had been South Africa. Mauritius, Botswana, Ghana are some of Africa's best governed countries, and they are countries in which China is very deeply engaged. So across the continent, and China is also engaged, as we know, in Sudan and Zimbabwe and Equatorial Guinea and other countries that are really badly governed. But across the continent, Chinese engagement will probably not foster significant change. And what it means is that significant change is going to continue to be up to Africans, which is really where it has been up until this point. And the second point is that China is not static on this. After blowback on Sudan and the Darfur tragedy and Zimbabwe, they changed. And in Sudan, the Chinese role has changed considerably over the years. And in part, this is due to the advocacy campaign, which was quite effective around the Olympics and really shook up the leadership in Beijing. And it made them consider, what actually do we mean when we talk about non-interference? And the concept of non-interference in the internal affairs of other countries is one that has undergone change and reinterpretation over the years. In Beijing, it's come to be reinterpreted, and it's been reinterpreted again around the Darfur issue. And it's interesting that both Andrew Natsios, who was President Bush's special envoy on the Darfur issue, and Scott Gratian, who is President Obama's special envoy, have both said that they appreciate China's role as being now part of the solution and not part of the problem, or not simply part of the problem. And so what China is doing is really pushing Khartoum to come to the negotiating table, because until there's a peace to hold, the peacekeepers don't have a peace to keep. And that's an important part of the solution for Darfur. And I was fascinated that when I was in Sharm el-Sheikh in November last year, there was a group of Africans who I got talking to about this. They found out I had written a book on this topic, which was just about to come out. And so they said to me at one point, why didn't China support us on the Bashir issue, being about Bashir being sent to the International Criminal Court and warrant issued for his arrest? Is why didn't China support the Africans on this? And I was trying to just figure out the nuances of what had happened there. And I said, well, can you explain this a little bit more? And they said, well, the African Union position and the position of African governments, and these were government officials, is that they did not want this to happen for many obvious reasons. And they thought China would support them. But China abstained. They allowed this, the Security Council allowed this to go forward, and the Chinese could have vetoed that. And so this was something that was looked at in Africa as like, China's not supporting us on this issue on Khartoum. And in Zimbabwe, and I should probably tell you that for my research on this, I went to Sierra Leone, Tanzania, Zambia, Zimbabwe, South Africa, Mozambique, Mauritius, and more recently, although it's not in the book, Egypt, I also had a research assistant who went to Angola, Egypt, Ethiopia, and the Democratic Republic of the Congo. And I draw on earlier research of mine in the Gambia and Liberia. So it's a number of different countries that do get mentioned here. And when I was in Zimbabwe, I found, and the government there was not very helpful for my research, I can tell you. But I did get quite a lot of information. And I found that the Chinese were really tired of Mugabe. And they were deeply frustrated at the failure of their economic engagement there. And according to all independent sources, they had actually put very little money into the country. The economic office in Zimbabwe spent a lot of time running to the Ministry of Finance, trying to get paid on many of the contracts that the Chinese companies had undertaken years earlier and had the government had not paid them. One Chinese company had tried for 6 years to finalize a contract at the Huanghe Colliery to build a power plant, a coal-powered power plant. And last week, Zimbabwe's Minister of Finance, Tendai Biti, was in Washington, and he's one of the key figures in the opposition in the inclusionary government. So I asked him about Chinese support for Mugabe, because I hadn't been able to interview him in Harare. And he said, and I quote him, "Before and after the inclusive government, Chinese economic engagement was very minimal." And so I asked him about press reports of these huge new Chinese deals with Zimbabwe, and he said they're all fiction. And so it seems to me that Mugabe is a bit like the Wizard of Oz, you know? He's there behind this, with his megaphone saying, "I have looked east, and I have all the support from China." And he projects this illusion to the world and to his people that he has a lot of support from Beijing. And actually, if you were to pull away this curtain, you would see that he's kind of standing there and he doesn't have this kind of support. And so I talk about that in the book as well. Now, Chinese companies that are operating in resource-rich, authoritarian countries like Chad or Congo-Brazzaville or Equatorial Guinea are doing all the same kinds of things that Western companies have been doing there for a long time. The kinds of things that have called us to have things like the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative. They're making shady deals, they're giving kickbacks, they're disrespecting the environment. They're resisting the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, just like our companies are. And their labor standards are usually far worse than ours, even if they actually employ far more locals than most people believe. And I'll give you an example, I think, a sad example that illustrates this. And this comes from Zambia, and some of you may know this story. In 2005, there was an explosion in an explosives factory on a Chinese mine in Chembishi in Zambia. This has gotten a lot of attention in the press because everybody in that factory was killed, more than 50 people. And it was due to lax safety standards, poor training, and a host of problems, and lack of enforcement by the part of the Zambian government, and lack of implementation by the Chinese owners. And this was a great tragedy, and it engendered a huge political backlash against the Chinese in Zambia. But note that all of the people that were killed in that factory, every single one was a Zambian. And it was a tragedy, but it is also an example of the reality that Chinese are employing Africans in not very good conditions, but they are providing jobs. So let me move on to my third point on governance, and that has to do with corruption. Now, we've heard a lot about how China is making corruption worse in Africa, but I'm not sure that's entirely the case, and I'll tell you why. My main piece of evidence here is that the large Chinese loans that are going in, that many people believe are cash, the way the IMF will give cash, or the policy loans from the World Bank, which will basically go in as money, or Standard Chartered Bank and the consortia that are giving money or lending money to African governments. They do also transfer funds, but the Chinese don't do that. They keep the money in China. And these are lines of credit that are then used to hire Chinese companies or to purchase Chinese goods and services. And the money then goes to pay the Chinese company in China, rather than coming into the coffers of African governments. And so I argue in the book that this resource-backed infrastructure loan, for example, in Angola, the first loan went in at $2 billion, and that paid for infrastructure. It paid for irrigation systems, it paid for water systems, it paid for electricity, it paid for the repair of bridges and roads. It's just this host of infrastructure projects. And none of the money came into Luanda. So it's an agency of restraint. And some of the funds from these resources can actually get used for development, just as Japan did with China so long ago. As one African official said to me, with China, you never see that money. So in conclusion, let me say that Chinese aid and state-sponsored engagement in Africa is different from ours, and it's different for 4 reasons. First, their foreign policy principles. The non-interference and mutual benefit are core, and we don't have that. Second, their core ideas about development are different, and they derive from their own experience, and our experience is very different. Third, China's experience as a recipient of aid and loans from the West and Japan gave them ideas about how this could be used for mutual benefit. And finally, China's becoming an East Asian developmental state. And we know what this looks like. We've seen Taiwan, we've seen Korea, we've seen Japan. We just haven't seen a country operating like this in Africa on this scale. So the last thing I'll say is that it's time to revise the conventional wisdom on what China's doing in Africa. It's time to know a little bit more about the realities behind the myths and which myths are realities. And this will help us to engage more effectively with China. That's why I wrote this book, and I hope you'll read it. Thank you.
We're going to open it up to questions. I have several, but I'm sure there's lots of questions based on this terrific presentation by Deborah. When you do ask a question, please let us know who you are and where you're from. Go ahead. The person who knew the author of the book.
Hi, I'm Bräutigam from Fortune magazine. Could you enlighten us on the comparative strengths of China and the U.S. in terms of investment in Africa? I've heard that, in terms of loan guarantees alone, the Chinese, dwarf the amount that United States companies have access to. And does that suggest that China's going to continue to outpace the U.S. in terms of African investment?
According to the data, China is not outpacing us in terms of investment. So
Right,
there's an idea. I'm not sure where they are in terms of if they're number 2, but we're higher than they are. But as I said, I don't think the investment data that we have from the Ministry of Commerce in China is all that good. So, but I don't think they're probably higher than we are in any cases. We're still investing quite a bit. And we have a lot of bank, in fact, in chapter 6 of my book, I look at these figures of loans that we have going in from the United States and from China, everything I've been able to pick up, and we're still quite a bit higher on all of the different measures of finance going in. But China does have access to a lot more instruments for promoting its companies than we do. They've got both Sinosure and the China Exim Bank, and both of those can provide guarantees. And then the Exim Bank is huge in terms of the export credits that it offers, and much, much higher than the United States export credits, which are paltry by comparison. And in terms of the other instruments that we have to guarantee investments, it is much smaller than what the Chinese have. And so even though a lot of our investment goes in without guarantees, so it's not using the U.S. Government for either the export credits or the guarantees to go in there. So I think in that sense, they have the potential to, even in the future, be much bigger, because Africa is still small for China. It's a small part of their global engagement, even though it's been rising. But it has the potential to get a whole lot bigger. And we, I think, are starting to wake up to this and looking at what can we do with our own guarantees and our export credit, which are paltry, as I said, and how can we enlarge those? Yes.
Bill Bruce, I'm retired. I put 4 battery plants in Africa about 40 years ago. I wrote the plans, but we used all big money. They're non-recourse loans. And you haven't mentioned them today. You might want to mention them, because I think they're a big part of what we do over there.
I'm sorry, what was the first part of what you said?
Well, I did the planning for 4 heavy battery plants.
Oh, okay.
We went into 4 different countries in the 60s, built in the 70s, and they all failed in the 80s. But the money provided came open. They were non-recourse loans, and that's a wonderful feature if you're going to invest somewhere. You go one way from your investment. It gets done.
OPIC is one of the instruments that we have.
I know. You didn't mention. I just thought I'd mention it to remind you of that.
No, it is. And I haven't actually looked at the figures for OPEC for what they put into Africa recently, so I'm not sure how big they are. But I do know that the export credits that we have, which are much, much smaller. And I imagine, I don't know, I don't want to say because I haven't actually
I
looked
don't
at
know
it.
myself. I have to actually read all of it.
There's another difference too, which is a little bit related to what you said here between China and the United States and the West more generally, and that is that China really sees Africa as an area of opportunity. And we tend to see Africa as either a problem, it's poor and it needs help, or it's harboring terrorism. And so this is our main framework for looking at Africa. And the companies that did go in with more enthusiasm in the 60s and 70s failed and left, many of them. And so that's true of Europe as well. And so the Chinese are coming in, and they've been doing this for quite a long time. They've been looking at Africa as an evolving area of potential, and not just for resources, for a host of different things.
I promise you first.
Thank you. Thank you, Deborah, for a very engaging presentation and for sharing your very insightful comments about China. I will certainly buy your book, by the way. It's already on.
I hope there'll be copies left, because it's been selling out at my talks.
Yes, I'm Leo Horn, Part-time from the UNDP, from the United Nations Development Program. I'm working on the China-Africa relationship.
Oh.
And I wanted to ask you a question about the privatization of this relationship, the China-Africa relationship. You've been talking about China as a unified, purposeful actor, agent in Africa's development. And the trend has very much been towards privatization of economic engagement. So my question is whether you've been looking into this trend and the implications of this trend for China's ability to continue to lead a state-sponsored, purposeful engagement and to capture the benefits of that, to take a strategic approach.
I think,
Could you repeat the question, please?
well, I'll try to do it in my answer, that he's talking about that there are many different Chinas, and there are many more Chinas today because the Chinese have moved away from the plan and they're moving toward the market. And so companies are less and less controlled, and they're supposed to go out and seek their own business, and they're supposed to operate by market principles. So this means that, and then the private sector is growing as well, and the state-owned ones that are acting like private ones and real private ones. So you have a host of different companies and actors in Africa that are China. And so he's saying I've been, what we call in academia, reifying China. I've been talking about it as though it's just one actor, and I absolutely, I do discuss this in the book. Because what Beijing is finding is that it has what some have called principal-agent problems. It can't control all of these different actors. It doesn't have the instruments to do that well. Some it can, and it has some ways to control some of the large state-owned enterprises. But as Chinese companies have their budgets increasingly hardened, they're going to be able to get finance on market terms, and those kinds of instruments for controlling them will become harder and harder. Now that aside though, what we find is that instruments and incentives still remain because, as I mentioned at the end of my talk, China is a developmental state, and so all of the different carrots and some sticks that they have, just as if any of you have read about Taiwan's emergence as a developmental state and some of the work of Robert Wade and others who have written on this, or Japan, it's a huge number of different instruments, taxes and tax exemptions and tariff kinds of things and loan funds, a host of different things that can act to shape behavior. So there still are possibilities there, as well as rules and regulations that are increasingly being developed at home on things like the environment and corporate social responsibility. Still a very early stage.
I'm John Beatty from Dinosaur Securities. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the competitive advantages of Chinese companies in comparison to US or other companies. And my own experience, I would say that certainly if you look at the construction industry, Chinese companies are far cheaper than, say, US companies or other companies. And I think this is also borne out of the data, which is why, to go back to your example, most Chinese companies tend to account for more than 50% of African Development Bank projects and almost half of the World Bank projects. So if that's the case, how would US companies or other Western companies compete given the high cost structure?
It's not going to be easy, just as we've been finding in a lot of areas. I think you've in some ways answered your question because you have a lot of information on this. Chinese companies have a lot more support from their government than our companies get, just because of the nature of how China works compared with our government, which is much more hands-off. But the companies themselves are extremely competitive, and they are willing to, as Chinese say, they'll eat bitterness. They'll eat bitterness, and they'll just really get down there and fight for business. And there can be Chinese companies that will be there for several years before they get a contract, and they'll be supported by their home company until they finally win contracts. And once they win contracts, they tend to win more. I'll give you an example of this competitiveness and this way of thinking. I interviewed the head of the Bank of China branch in Lusaka, and he was also the head of the China Business Association there. And he was just leaving for a trip back to Beijing. And so at the end of our interview, he actually went out to the airport. And as we were walking out, one of his assistants said to me, and I can't remember his name, it was something like Mr. Liu. He said to me, Mr. Liu flies economy class, even though he is qualified to fly business class, but he wants to save the company money. And so I can just imagine how many bankers would do that in order to save the bank money. So it's an idea of this kind of thing that we're in there. We're going to do it the most efficient way we can, and perhaps we'll be flying economy class. And this is very hard to compete against. So I think where we have to compete is at the higher end, in the more skilled level. But it's going to be hard in Africa. We probably have to compete back here.
Yes.
My name is Anthony Gorado. I'm from the UNDP Africa. At the risk of simplifying a really complex set of relations, in your view, does the economics of China's commercial expansion drive its foreign policy, or is it the other way around? Or I suppose another alternative, are they one and the same?
That's a great question. And I would say that there's no single answer to that. As with any complex power, it really depends on the circumstances. But I would say that from what I've seen in Africa and in many African countries, that economics is the most important, and business is the most important factor. But within that, the Taiwan issue will trump it, partly trump it. It's interesting that Chinese companies still do business in countries that recognize Taiwan. So you see the Ministry of Commerce statistics, Chinese companies are going after contracts, and their trade and investment and so on can happen, even if the country recognizes Taiwan. But that level of politics is really important. Anything that goes with in the internal affairs kind of issue. But economics and business is really a driving force.
Hi, Constance Hunter from Coronat Asset Management. I think one of the things that's gotten very bad press for the Chinese in Africa is the child labor issue. And while it's quite possible that there was child labor going on before the Chinese got there, and around the Chinese involvement, it's separate from the Chinese involvement. There's a headline that I think is bad for them. And did you talk to anyone about that, and do you get a sense that they want to try to correct that, or do they have a benign sort of view of that?
The child labor that, I didn't actually see any child labor, but the child labor that I've read about has been in places like the DRC, where it's really a reflection of a war-torn post-conflict situation in which you have a lot of kids out there that are either orphans or they're scrabbling. And I do talk about this in the book. And I don't think I haven't ever seen an official Chinese position on this, but mainly the child labor would be in a really informal situation, which you have private companies. Often, in the example that I give in the book, it's an African company that is using child workers and then selling to a Chinese middleman. So it's not even directly, he's not employing the children himself. But I think this kind of problem is one that's much more complicated than when you have orphans who are trying to put bread in their mouths. What do you do in a situation where there's no institutional framework to take care of children like that, no orphanages and so on? And so this is a really difficult situation. The Chinese companies in Africa are mostly working in big things like big mines and big construction projects, and they wouldn't want to hire children in those situations. Jerry?
Hi, Sheridan Prasso, also from Fortune Magazine. I'm interested in hearing more about the special economic zones that you mentioned, and you said that they demonstrate what China has already learned from its experience in Africa. I'd like to hear more about that. And also you said that the majority of them are not in Africa, that they're elsewhere, and so I'd like to hear, are they trying to increase it in Africa, and what's their kind of geopolitical focus for this worldwide?
I'm writing a paper about that right now, and so you might have to wait until I finish that paper. But about the ones outside of Africa, because I focused on the Africa ones in the book. So you've asked a couple of different things there. If you have 7 in Africa and 19 worldwide, so that's about a little more than a third are in Africa, which makes sense. Some of them are in Latin America, and many are in Asia. There's one in Russia, and so on. But and I have the list of them. I think it's in the book, the whole list. Now, what has China learned? What they learned in the past is that their aid projects, their infrastructure projects, and particularly the productive projects, weren't sustainable, because they would do the project, they would hand it over to the government, and then it would collapse. And what they did, and we didn't see this, I saw it because I was doing research on this, is that they would send teams back. The Tanzan Railway, they would renovate it. A stadium, they would send a team to repair it. A huge office building that was built for a government, they would send a team back and retile it. An irrigation system, they would send a team back and repair the dam. And they did this through the 80s, through the 90s. And they got really tired of it. And they said, we've got to do something different. And so in part, I think, this zone model is bringing Chinese businesses in. They're supposed to run these zones for profit. They're supposed to bring in mostly Chinese businesses, but African businesses are welcome as well. And now these small, medium enterprises are getting financed so that they can invest in the zones. And so that seems to be that they're listening. They're saying that we want employment, we want investment, we want manufacturing, and this is what African governments want, and the Chinese companies will make sure that it's sustainable.
Sir, we only have time for one more question.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I have 2 short questions.
Can you tell us who you are, please?
No, sorry, my name is Adeli Krichi. I'm with the UNDP. You talked about China seeing Africa as an opportunity. Do you think that this type of thinking, as China grows in Africa, will change the way other foreign investors operate in Africa? And the second is, how do you see the Africa-China relation addressing key challenges like poverty? You have talked mostly about the big corporation in Africa, but we also have smaller companies going to Africa, and these have some social implications. Did you look into those smaller companies, and what do you think that type of relationship is creating?
I think that this is what you're talking about is already happening. This Chinese interest in Africa and the rise in exports of raw materials to China has increased the price of raw materials, and this has created commodity booms, although they've gone down with the economic recession. But in some instances, this is already starting to move back up. And so this is an opportunity for natural resource exporters to get it right now. And there is certainly a huge amount of interest by companies that are not Chinese in natural resources in Africa, including Indian companies and Brazilian companies who are now in the mix. Now, what I've seen happening is that Chinese interest in infrastructure has actually stimulated the donor community to start doing infrastructure again. And so this is something I hear a lot, that in Liberia, for example, that the Chinese came in, they started doing roads, and the donor community looked around, they said, I guess we should be doing roads. And this has happened in other instances as well. Now, when you talk about poverty, we in the West have a lot of certainties about how Africa should develop and what they should do. And the problem with our certainties is that they change regularly. So the recipe for what Africa should do changes regularly. For the Chinese, it's much simpler. In China, they have a saying, to get wealthy, build a road. And so they build roads. And they also have a saying, they say agriculture is the foundation, industry is the leading edge. And so they focus on those sectors, and they focus their aid and also their investment on those sectors. And so for them, reducing poverty is about developing business and providing jobs and getting investment happening. And so that's why the tools that they're using tend to focus on those kinds of things and not on microfinance and not on the kinds of poverty reduction programs that we tend to do in the West, because that's not how they reduce poverty in China.
I'm sorry we don't have time, Union, I apologize. For other questions, I just want to close with three things. One is, again, to thank all of you for coming, and especially all of you who are new to our programs. There's a huge contingent here from the United Nations, which we understand why, given the topic that Deborah's talking about, but we do hope you'll join us for other programs if you have an interest, not just in the Africa part of the China relationship, China/relationship, but we now have your names, and we hope you'll join us for other programs. I also want to tout, although it is way out of date, you should definitely get Deborah's book first and read it. But several years ago, the National Committee did a project on Chinese foreign aid. It was at a point where we thought that China was finally beginning to be willing to talk about its foreign aid issues openly. As Deborah has said, they're very secretive about things. The amount of aid that China gives is a state secret. Nobody can get to that. Although in Deborah's book, she does give some examples of leaders giving some information. So I brought 3 or 4 copies, which I'm happy to hand out to people, but it's also online. If you just go to our website, www.ncuscr.org, you can find this along with other publications that we have. And then finally, I just want you all to join me in thanking Deborah for a really interesting